Hi everyone, hello once again from me, Donald Robertson, here in Athens in Greece. Please take a moment just to say hi and where you're from in the comments section below, where you're watching from. This week again I've had to record the webinar immediately beforehand and upload it to YouTube because I can't find a suitable location in Athens with the bandwidth to stream live video, at least not on a Sunday. But I think this is good enough, hopefully. It's almost live, it's that far away from being live. So the agenda today, as usual, just to do some introductions, a little bit of housekeeping, the discussion from the previous week I'll respond to, and then I'll do a preview of week 3, which is the week that's just beginning. And then afterwards, if you want to comment below, I'll check back and I'll respond to any questions that you post on YouTube. I always go through and try to respond to like 90% of the comments that people post in the e-learning course itself, and there's some of them that I don't think really call for a response necessarily, but usually I'll try and comment on the majority of them. So housekeeping and news and stuff this week. There's a lot of stuff going on at the moment, like I probably can't even cover everything. Some of it's a little bit at a tangent to the course itself, but it has to do with Stoicism and stuff, so it's worth mentioning. The big news for me anyway is that my book comes out on Tuesday. That's pretty close now. That's mainly a big deal for me, believe it or not, because once it's released, I can then move on to my next project. So I'm kind of like drumming my fingers a little bit, waiting for that to happen so that I can begin work, hopefully, fingers crossed, on a graphic novel about Marcus Aurelius. So I'm keen to get started on that, but I can't get started until the current book has been released. So as part of that, I have to do a lot of promotional stuff for my publisher, which means I've generated so much content about Stoicism over the past 6 months or so that it's actually difficult for me to keep updating people about it. I just did the Evolving Warfighter podcast from Carnuntum with Franklin Annis, just talking about Stoicism and Marcus Aurelius and Carnuntum in general. I've done that for the second time. Also for the second time I did the Sunday Stoic podcast. Just talking again, I think I did that from Carnuntum as well, like talking about Stoicism and stuff. If you want to just Google those and look those up. Also did an interview with Marcus Wachter, who's the CEO or basically the kind of general manager of the Carnuntum Archaeological Park. Carnuntum's the place where Marcus Aurelius wrote at least some of the meditations, I think probably most of the meditations. How do we know that? Because helpfully, and historians love this, he wrote at Carnuntum in the book. It's very helpful of him. Thanks Marcus for doing that. So I had an interview, my chair slightly. Had an interview with Marcus Wachter, his namesake, and it turned out pretty well. We've got it pretty nicely edited, and that's gone out in the Classical Wisdom Weekly, which is a big website and newsletter about classical stuff. And I did an in-depth review for the Daily Stoic, which I don't think is out yet, but will probably come out in the next few days. And I've done also recently lots of articles, like 3 or 4 separate articles about Marcus Aurelius and Stoicism for pain management, and probably a lot of other stuff as well. So if you follow me on Twitter, you'll see a lot of stuff about Marcus Aurelius, Stoicism, not all of which I can even cram into this course. And the book, just another aside about the book, like we originally had a voice actor planned to do the audiobook, but I went into the studios of Paw Patrol in downtown Toronto to Voodoo Highway Studios, but a shout out to them, and did the audio recording there. And I went straight from that to the airport to fly to Austria, so it was kind of pretty intense. But so I did the audio recording, which is pretty cool. I'm pleased about that. And the other big thing, which is less about me for a change and more about other stuff that's going on in the world of Stoicism, although I am organising it, is that Stoicon Athens has just been announced. So that the 7th International Stoicism or Modern Stoicism Conference, which I'm co-organising with Alkistis Agio in Athens, which, I mean, the really cool thing about that is the venue and the location and the speakers, although we haven't actually announced those yet. But it's, for the first time, a really amazing location for people that are interested in classical philosophy. So if you want to come to that, it's in Athens. It's at the American School of Classical Studies on the 5th and 6th of October. And we've got an amazing venue called Cotson Hall. It's very modern, extremely comfortable lecture theatre. It's in an amazing, beautiful location, and it gives us all sorts of opportunities for exploring the area. I'm like nerdily into the history of Athens and how it relates to Stoicism, and like I just think it's massively underappreciated, like the relevance and significance of a lot of the areas in central Athens, you know. So there's the Stoa Poikile itself, which is not really that much to see. It's just some kind of rubble, really. But then there's loads of other stuff that is amazing in Athens, and you know, a lot of it is very relevant to Stoicism. Even the Lyceum, Chrysippus, the third head of the Stoic school, lectured at the Lyceum, and it's not just about Aristotle. There's more to it than that. And the Acropolis, the Stoics had the school at the Areopagus, the foot of the Acropolis as well, allegedly. There's a lot of Stoic history in Athens, so and you know, I'm excited as well because I really love tortoises, and there are tortoises there. So have a look at the announcement on the Modern Stoicism website, and hopefully we'll see some of you along at the conference. I'm almost certainly going to have to talk about Marcus Aurelius, not an Athenian. Everyone else will be talking about stuff to do with Athens and Greek Stoicism, I think. But you know, it's going to be interesting. So plugs out of the way, and let's get into the week 2 discussion. And the first excerpt we were discussing was about Marcus getting out of bed. People often mention one or two of those passages. They notice that there are a couple of passages in Marcus Aurelius where he talks about getting up in the morning, and he kind of says different things about it as well. So, you know, big picture stuff here. Marcus clearly, as in many cases in the Meditations, you know, he's clearly saying that he has a daily routine. You know, he's clearly implying that anyway. He's saying, you know, this is the thing that I do every morning when I get up. And other Stoics kind of talk about that as well. So sometimes when people read the Stoics, I think traditionally they thought, yeah, it's a lot of kind of interesting philosophical musings. But when I read the Stoics, I see people that are describing a systematic daily psychological regime that they follow. And this is one of the clearest examples of that in Marcus. You know, he says he does this when he gets up in the morning. So he has a routine that he follows to practice Stoicism. And that's kind of reinforced by many other passages that we find in the Stoic literature and the kind of ancillary literature as well. Like Galen talks about this as well. These passages are well known from Marcus. One of the most famous passages in Meditations is Meditations 2.1, where he talks about getting up in the morning. And in a sense, that's the beginning of the Meditations proper, because book 1 looks like it was maybe written at a different time, and it was clearly written in a different style from the rest of the book. So the text proper kind of begins, or the main content begins with that passage 2.1. It's the opening passage. And also the Meditations was originally titled To Himself, and that passage is one of many that happen to say to yourself. So the language that he uses reflects the original title of the book, as a bit of trivia for you. And I think there are actually 3 or 4 passages altogether where Marcus talks about waking up in the morning. He was a night owl, incidentally, and kept quite strange hours. He had chronic insomnia. And incidentally, there's a very similar passage which I had to include from Seneca, just to show you that often people think this is Marcus talking, but really it seems like he may well be paraphrasing or quoting an earlier author. We don't know, because ancient authors often didn't cite their sources. It just wasn't a convention that they followed. And in particular, these are private notes anyway. So in many places, Marcus is quoting Greek tragedies or earlier philosophers, and he doesn't really make that clear. But there's a very similar passage to this in Seneca, an earlier Stoic author. And so I suspect that they're both paraphrasing or being influenced by an earlier Stoic source. Like, we don't know who. I don't think Marcus would be quoting Seneca or paraphrasing Seneca, because he generally doesn't refer to him, incidentally. So in the comments under that, Philip said something about sometimes people only see part of these excerpts on social media and they get the wrong impression about Stoicism. Yeah, like the Stoics, when they're quoted out of context, sometimes seem a bit harsher than they actually are. And also there are many misquotes about Stoicism on social media. Like these kind of remarks, many of them actually do stand quite well in isolation, but they're intended to be interpreted within the context of the whole system of philosophy. I mean, anyone that doesn't get that is really missing one of the most characteristic things about Stoicism. In the ancient world, Stoicism was renowned for being a highly systematic philosophy. It was a big structure of philosophy. It was known for that. That's how Cicero, for example, and other authors describe it. And we don't really have a clear picture of that structure, that kind of hierarchy of ideas that formed Stoicism. We can sort of infer it. But, there's this illusion that many of the Stoic passages are quite laconic, aphoristic, they stand on their own, and they kind of do, but at the same time they fit into a highly systematic philosophy of life. John said this describes this kind of positive thinking, I would call it, idea from a TED talk. Sometimes those things work, and like there's some contemporary research that uses techniques like that. But actually the problem that you described, John, with that technique is one that ACT researchers in particular, or relational frame theory researchers, would go on about a lot, which is when people repeat positive affirmations or positive thoughts, like many people, particularly people with certain types of psychological diagnosis, but everyone to some extent, they'll like describe a kind of rebound effect, a kind of psychological reaction to positive thinking. Like the more they try and think positively, the more negative automatic thoughts will pop into their mind in response to it. So it's kind of a hit and miss strategy in some ways. It can work better in the short term than it does in the long term. That is not what the Stoics typically do. Sometimes people even describe the Stoics as pioneers of negative thinking, sort of purposeful negative thinking, like the premeditatio malorum. The Stoics are much more interested not in the content of our thoughts, like say this positive thing to yourself, but in the way that we relate to our thoughts. And to use a horrible jargon term that we use, that modern psychologists would understand, Stoicism is highly metacognitive. Like it's about the way that we think about our thinking, and that's typical of philosophy. Philosophy is all about thinking about thinking. So it's not about think this. It's rather thinking differently about the way that we form thoughts and the way that we relate to them. So I think Stoicism is a more metacognitive, and there's a trend there's a large volume of modern research and a trend in modern research to say that really, if we want to achieve psychological change, it has to happen more at the metacognitive level rather than sort of just telling ourselves specific positive thoughts. Stefan says, talks about how the Stoics show humility and admit difficulties and flaws, and that's very encouraging to newcomers. Yeah, absolutely. And that's always been a thing about Stoicism. The Stoic school was originally called, give me a second because this is a tongue twister, Zenonism? Like, if I remember rightly, something like that. Like, it was named after Zeno or Zenon, the founder of the school, very briefly, I think, and then they quickly changed it to the Stoic school, named after the place where they met. And most schools of ancient philosophy are named after the founders. Particularly in this respect, what stand out are Pythagoreanism and Epicureanism, where the founders were very much held up as celebrated, almost divine, sage-like figures. And the Stoics refused to do that with Zeno or Chrysippus or Cleanthes. They didn't think that they were perfect sages. And I think that's really important. And it reminds me of a passage in Seneca where he says to Lucilius that his role isn't to be like an expert, like a physician. Seneca's role isn't. But to be like a patient in the next bed who's been undergoing treatment for longer and can offer some observations about how his own treatment has proceeded. So he's recognising his imperfections, his flaws, and he says, look, all I can do is talk about my experience of undergoing treatment. I'm not an expert, I'm not a guru. And I think that's probably what Zeno said as well. And that's why Stoicism doesn't have a guru. It's not a personality cult in the way that other philosophical sects arguably were, or were more inclined to be certainly Pythagoreanism. Pythagoras is almost like a divine figure for the Pythagoreans. Michael said he likes to mention little plants, birds, ants, spiders, bees doing their natural work. This is a very important recurring metaphor in Marcus Aurelius. I think it's interesting how often he refers to bees. I wonder if the Romans around him kept bees, perhaps. But certainly when I went to Carnuntum, there are lots and lots of little birds that you hear chirping in the trees along the banks of the Danube. And so, I was trying to kind of imagine Marcus writing these comments in that context. And when he talks about nature in that way, it's really easy to do it. Like literally, as he was writing those words in the Meditations, he was probably hearing all the little birds like chirping outside, and maybe he saw ants and spiders and bees around him, like you would in many places. But it really kind of brought the Meditations to life for me when I visited the place where he wrote some or much of it. In the main discussion, how can Stoicism help us to manage anxiety? Reb said stuff about using a range of Stoic techniques to deal with a difficult family situation with her daughter. Marcus certainly uses this I could be dead tomorrow strategy a lot. He also reminds himself that the other person could be dead or gone tomorrow, and that eventually they'll both be dead and gone, and one day completely forgotten by other people, which might sound a little bit morbid, but as you said, many people find that a really effective coping strategy, and it's dead simple. What matters is that here and now, from moment to moment, we're satisfied that we're responding as wisely as we can to whatever it is that fate sends us. And it can be really important to have a rapid technique for coping like that, and one that doesn't require much thinking. Listen, I'm a cognitive psychotherapist, right? I've done thousands of hours of therapy with clients and supervision with other therapists and training. I ran a training school for other therapists. One of the most common things that people say when they go into therapy, they actually say this about therapy, but it's kind of an error that they make about therapy, a misinterpretation in a way. People often say, well, you can read all these books and do all this stuff, but it all goes out the window in the situation itself, right? And actually, that's not how therapy works anyway. One of my stock things was to explain to people like the three or so different ways in which therapy employs strategies to make sure that changes transfer to the target situation. If the therapist isn't doing that, then they're not doing therapy properly. That's the whole point of therapy, is that the skills changes and cognitive changes transfer to the actual problem situation. And one of them is to learn a very short technique, like a really rapid fire technique that you can use. So in the middle of a heated argument, you're not suddenly going to go, hold on a minute, while I have a debate with myself about the pros and cons of thinking this way, and while I explore alternative perspectives, and that might be difficult, right? So you might just say to yourself, listen, I could be dead tomorrow, or one day we're all going to be dead and everybody's going to have forgotten about us and this is all going to be over with. And you might be able to snap into it. So, not everyone was going to be able to do that as easily, but some people will be able to do it really easily, other people do it more easily with practice. But a really simple little coping statement like that might be enough to snap you into an alternative perspective in the heat of the moment. So you're absolutely right about that, although there are other ways that therapists will address that issue of generalisation or transferring change to the real situation. Stefan said, reflecting on impermanence helps to cope with anxiety. Yeah, I'd like to talk about that a little bit. I would say that to imagine impermanence, it's almost, I feel like there's something odd about the way when we talk about impermanence or transience. Part of it, as Marcus rightly knows, is that we're imagining the absence of the thing that we're currently facing. So to imagine the impermanence of something that's bothering us or that we desire is to broaden our perspective and imagine its absence as well as its presence. He knows that. He's smart enough and psychologically astute enough, sophisticated enough in his psychological parsing of the situation to actually phrase it like that. I find that almost shocking. Like, he's way ahead, Marcus Aurelius, in his psychological sophistication in understanding these kind of issues compared to many modern self-help authors. So he's like, yeah, of course, I'm imagining the absence of the thing, like when I think about it, how it's limited in time and so on. To do that requires broadening the scope of our perception, our awareness. There's a ton of research nowadays on widening or narrowing attention, the allocation of attention in general, and how that affects mood. And it means like if you if you're thinking of something painful or upsetting, and you imagine that you're kind of putting it under a magnifying glass, and you're forgetting about everything else. Now, first of all, the Stoics would say that's a kind of lie of omission. It's kind of taking things out of context. The totality is reality, and if you're only picturing this one little bit that you've cut out of reality, then that's false. It's a lie you're telling yourself, because it's not the whole picture. It's not the whole truth, right? And so therefore, it's a lie. It's a falsehood. It's a form of self-deception. It only becomes true when you fit it within the bigger picture and you put it in context. And to do that, we have to broaden the scope of our attention, which is not something that we instinctively do. We normally do the opposite when we're upset about things. So it takes effort to broaden the scope of our attention, to think about something's presence, and also at the same time to think about its future or past absence or potential absence. And that inevitably dilutes the intensity of our emotional response, because we were previously just responding to one kind of sharp edge of an experience, and now we're responding to lots of other kind of dull experiences at the same time. So it becomes just one sharp point within a much bigger, more diverse picture, which tends to mean that we have a more complex emotional response and a more moderate and balanced emotional response to the situation. So it's all about broadening our perspective. The Stoics do that in many different ways, and they go on and on about it. I think that's very important. John has been using ACT, or acceptance and commitment therapy. We pronounce it ACT, incidentally. Occasionally you'll hear people pronouncing it ACT, which shows that they don't really know anything about the subject. That's everyone knows you pronounce it ACT, incidentally. Some people just pronounce it wrong because they don't actually know anything about it. So John's been using ACT, and he, I think, heard the OCD podcast that I did, talking about Stoicism and anxiety. And I guess in that I talked about metacognitive therapy, which is another third wave therapy, which is developed in Britain by Professor Adrian Wells at Manchester University. I've met Adrian Wells, and I did a workshop with him years ago, and I'm a big fan of metacognitive therapy. There are fewer researchers working on it than on ACT, but it's very similar to ACT, but it's much more focused. ACT is more in the behavioural tradition. Metacognitive therapy is much more in the cognitive psychology tradition. I'm more inclined towards behavioural psychology, but I actually think metacognitive therapy is a better therapy. Like it's kind of more reductionist, it's more focused, but it gets the same, if not better, results. Although it's still relatively early days. But the researchers working on these things now are much, much more sophisticated in their methods, and so metacognitive therapy definitely is something you're going to be hearing a lot more about in the future, without a shadow of doubt. Adrian Wells, incidentally, was one of the pioneers of second wave cognitive therapy for certain disorders like social anxiety in particular, and then he's one of these guys that said, even though I'm one of the experts in this subject, I've changed my mind about it, I've decided it was wrong. And he makes a big thing out of that, saying, I think we made some fundamental mistakes in the way we conceptualized cognitive therapy before, and so that's why he's renamed what he does as a different approach. But he was one of the experts in the previous model of therapy. So week 3 is about pain and illness. Like I said, I've done loads of articles and podcasts and stuff about pain and illness. I feel like I have. I haven't linked all of them in the course. A lot of them kind of cover similar material, but if you want to go into this in more detail, there's stuff out there. There also is an entire mini course, a crash course on Stoic pain management on my website on learn.donaldrobertson.name, which you can enroll on. And it's just kind of focuses on similar stuff. It's got, I think, a different audio recording on it. The idea was that we were going to do research on that in the health service in the UK. We haven't kind of got round to doing that yet, but I've gathered a lot of data just kind of provisionally from participants. About 300 or 400 people have done the beta version of that crash course in pain management, Stoic pain management, and the feedback we had was it was extremely positive. And I mean, let me put it this way: like, the idea was it was beta testing, and I thought, well, we'll try this, and then I'm maybe going to have to revise it and improve it before we do studies on it. And actually, I don't think I'm going to change very much about it, because the feedback from people was that they were, really happy with the course design as it stands. So it looks like it doesn't even really need that much to change about it, and it's designed to be testable. So it's a simplified version. That it does take some elements of Stoicism out of context, because this reminds me, I'll try to avoid getting a big digression about metacognitive therapy now, because actually that it kind of relates to that as well. To do modern research in psychotherapy, it's much better if you really can isolate one or two key concepts and techniques. You can't test a therapy if it's too complicated and consists of 101 different techniques all being used at the same time, because you don't know which one of them is actually working, and all the participants might actually be doing different versions of it. So, I tried to keep this as pared down and simple as I could, and as faithful to Stoicism as I could. So you end up with a kind of subset of Stoic pain management techniques in the crash course on pain management, but it's testable. So the video in the pain and illness section is focused on the first Marcomannic War. I've been talking a lot about that. I just did these 2 interviews with it. Also with Edward Paulhammer, who's the scientific director or director of archaeology at Carnuntum. I'm just about to publish an interview that I did with him about that period in history, from about 169-ish AD to 175 AD, the first Marcomannic War, when Marcus Aurelius had to drive the Marcomanni and the other northern tribes out of Italy, out of Pannonia and the other northern provinces. He had to liberate parts of the Roman Empire from this huge invasion, and then spent years fighting along the Danube, the Roman frontier, against these enemies of numerous tribes, but mainly the Marcomanni, the Quadi, and the Sarmatians. So a bit of history there. And so this is a big transition. Marcus has to leave Rome, maybe for the first time. It's believed for the first time. I'm not 100% sure about that personally, but that's the way that historians normally interpret it. And it's a different climate. He's in basically Austria and Serbia now, rather than in Italy. And so it's in military camps he's staying. He's surrounded by the plague now, so his conditions have massively deteriorated, and we know that he struggled physically and in terms of the existing health conditions that he had. So he was 48, he had chronic health problems, height of a plague, he had no military experience as far as we know. Several of his mentors had died, his brother and co-emperor had just died, and he rode to the Danube to take command of the largest army ever assembled on the Roman frontier, about 140,000 men in total in the army massed along the northern frontier. So his health conditions probably got worse because of his tough circumstances, and particularly the cold winters and so on. The strategies that I can identify in Marcus, he doesn't give us a clear list like he does with anger, for example, but we can identify a bunch of strategies. So one of them that he uses a lot is just separating his mind from his body. He repeatedly talks about the pain being over there in the body. So there's a kind of distancing or physicalizing of the pain. Remembering that fear of pain does more harm than the pain itself, which is a kind of functional analysis type maneuver, particularly that we use that in therapy to enhance clients' motivation for change, to their motivation to use other therapy techniques, which usually require some patience and effort. Number 3, he reminds himself to view sensations objectively, fantasia cataleptica, like a physician analysing them, or a natural philosopher just describing them in a detached way. Epictetus and Marcus both describe pain as just a rough sensation, or pleasure as a smooth sensation. So they're trying to find ways to reframe pain and kind of take away the value judgments from it by just describing it as a particular type of disturbance or sensation in the body, in a kind of detached manner. Number 4, viewing pain sensations as being limited spatially and belonging to a particular area in the body where relevant. And again, that encourages us to think of consciousness as much bigger and a kind of broadening of our perspective, and not fusing or identifying with the pain too much, but kind of seeing it as over there and limited in scope. And following on from that, number 5, viewing sensations as transient and changeable. I won't go into this in detail, but a kind of flip side of both of those strategies is that it kind of tricks your mind or encourages your mind to think more about potential ways of coping. Whereas when people are struggling with pain, they tend to think, this is all consuming, it's unbearable, and there's no way I can cope with it. And those are the thoughts that they have through going through their mind. But if you're focusing on pain and kind of forcing yourself to think, it's over there, it's limited to a particular part of my body, it could be much worse, like it's not going to last forever. Placing limits on it in that way forces you to think of it as manageable and to start thinking about potential ways that you could cope with it, and that'll tend to make it less stressful and to flip around your experience into a more constructive one. Number 6, letting go of the struggle against bad or harmful sensations and actively accepting them as being indifferent. Some of the best metaphors for this come from the Cynic writers, but the Stoics inherit that Cynic tradition. And this is very, we call modern third wave therapy mindfulness and acceptance-based therapy, and acceptance and commitment therapy has that in its name as well. So this idea of radically accepting unpleasant feelings, paradoxically, accepting feelings, like not trying to ignore them, trying to force them out of our mind, trying to change them, trying to control them, letting go of all of that, like letting go of that whole experiential control agenda, and just kind of going with the pain, welcoming the pain, accepting the pain, sitting with the pain patiently for a while, letting go of any resistance or reaction to the pain, just allowing it to be, however you want to phrase it, basically doing nothing in response to the pain, like, reducing, like doing the bare minimum, like just letting go of all the battle against it, paradoxically will tend to reduce our experience of pain for a number of reasons. I'll mention this very briefly, but because I find that it helps. Like, people are very reluctant to do this because they don't understand the benefits of doing it. But actually, some of the benefits are really easy to explain. So one of them is that when we're struggling against pain and trying to get rid of it, we usually commit ourselves to viewing it in a negative way. So applying a kind of negative value judgment to it. It's harmful, it's frightening, it's terrible. And the more we indulge in that negative thinking, the more we'll automatically tend to allocate attention to it. Your brain will just go, well, I better pay attention to it, and put it under the magnifying glass then. Well, you really don't want to do that with pain, because it's going to make it more painful if you put it under a magnifying glass. Whereas if you go, yeah, it's just a rough sensation, it's not a big deal, it's not going to kill me, like, assuming it isn't, right? Like, it's just chronic pain or whatever, or it's a dental procedure or something like that. You go, it's kind of irrelevant pain, it's just background noise. It's not worth paying attention to. Then your brain will go, yeah, I guess I can forget about it then, and it won't put it under the magnifying glass. Not only will it kind of wander freely onto other things, but your scope of attention will broaden, which will dilute the intensity of the experience, right? But as long as you think, this is a big deal, I hate this, and it's horrible, then your brain will go, well, I better pay lots of attention to it, put it under the magnifying glass, and that really is not what you want. And there are a bunch of other reasons, actually, that I won't go into now, why it's counterproductive to do that. But it's a big deal, because it's instinctively we want to fight with pain. That's what everybody does. So it takes thoughtfulness, reflection, and effort and patience to train ourselves to do the opposite and learn this attitude of radical acceptance. It's a knack, a mind trick, and some people find it really easy, some people find it a little bit hard to wrap their head around. And finally, we've kind of implied this already, but Marcus consistently tends to ask himself, what virtues has nature given me in order to cope better with pain and similar problems? And that goes hand in hand with asking what virtues do other people exercise when coping with pain. A good way to do that is to look at people that have experienced pain or similar problems to the ones that you're experiencing and are coping well with it or coping better with it. Look for good role models. Like, who's got a physical problem like this or worse and is dealing with it in a way that I find admirable or praiseworthy, and then think, well, could I be more like them? Because you can always find examples of people that are coping better. and ask yourself how they're coping better. What is it that they're actually doing? What's the attitude that they have? And what are they telling themselves that allows them to do this? I used to demonstrate pain control when it wasn't really my specialism, but I had trained therapists in it, and so I demonstrated a lot of things called Alice clamps. One of my mentors, my supervisor as a therapist, my first supervisor, a guy called John Butler, who's a hypnotherapist and psychotherapist and an expert on pain management. He did a Channel 4 documentary called Hypnosurgery, which I would suggest that you look at. It's one of the best documentaries I've ever seen on hypnosis, clinical hypnosis and pain control. And John taught me how to do self-hypnosis for pain control. I trained my ex-wife how to do it, and she gave birth to our daughter Poppy, at home, without even a paracetamol or an aspirin or anything, no medication at all, by using self-hypnosis techniques that she'd learned. So Poppy's a hypno baby. Next excerpt is about Apollonius and about Maximus as well, Claudius Maximus. Apollonius seems to have been a famous teacher who's based in Athens. He's he's one of the characters, he's the speaker, and one of my favourite books about Marcus Aurelius, called the Eulogium on Marcus Aurelius. He's portrayed giving this eulogy at Marcus's death when he would have been very elderly, because he was already about 20 years older than him. And we don't know much about Apollonius of Chalcedon, but he seems to have been perhaps the most famous teacher of Stoicism at that time, and he's a role model to Marcus in terms of someone who's coped with the loss of children and severe pain and illness himself. So we'll look at what Marcus says about that. Again, Marcus is looking at these guys going, look how well they coped with really terrible pain and illness. What can I learn from that? We can see him doing that in the meditations. And then this guy Claudius Maximus, who was not a Stoic lecturer as far as we know, but a highly accomplished politician, statesman and military veteran, who probably died early-ish, maybe even before Marcus was acclaimed. We know when he died, I think. We've got a rough idea when he died. If I remember rightly, he died round about the time Marcus was acclaimed emperor, or just before that. From memory, I'll need to look that up. We have a clue as to when he probably died. And Marcus clearly says, he's one of his Stoic mentors. He particularly, he was like a role model to him, particularly in terms of how he coped with illness. Marcus kind of refers in passing to Claudius Maximus's death, I think about 3 or 4 times in the meditations. So it sounds like it clearly had a big impression on him, because this would have been 1 or 2 decades later that he's remembering it. Then we have these stories about Marcus writing his letters to Fronto and how those compare to the letter of Epicurus that he quotes. I think it's very interesting to contrast those two things. And I'll dwell on that in my book in particular a little bit, as a kind of contrast between philosophy and rhetoric. So Fronto, rhetorician, he doesn't care about philosophy and the philosophical use of language. He tends to complain a lot about his pain and illness. I think maybe that's a little bit unfair to Fronto, but certainly these two letters are very different. Several letters from Fronto and one from Epicurus that Marcus quotes show somebody suffering from pain and illness. Fronto had gout, Epicurus had kidney stones, and maybe other problems, and Epicurus was dying, perhaps when he wrote that letter, certainly when he wrote his other letter. The way they talk about their problem and describe it is quite contrasting. I think Marcus was perhaps aware of that contrast. The audio recording is about the techniques that we've mentioned and how Marcus used them. And then there's the audio exercise, which is similar to the one that's used. I think it's a different recording, but it's similar to the one that's used in the Crash Course in Stoic Pain Management. The discussion, as usual, is about the pros and cons of these ways of dealing with pain. In particular, what do you think of the pros and cons of radical acceptance, of accepting pain sensations? I mean, by the way, just to be crystal clear, that doesn't exclude having treatment for them. But on the assumption that you've done everything that you can, or there's nothing else that you can do for the time being, then you have no choice in a sense but to accept pain. So often the Stoics are advising us to do what in a sense just seems common sense, or we have no choice but to do. Don't try to control things that aren't under your control, for example. It's almost a truism, that we should accept painful feelings that we can't do anything else about. It seems like a truism, but most people do the opposite and try to battle against them or avoid them or repress them or whatever. Suppress them, I should say. The bonus content is an article I wrote about the Antonine Plague. Actually, it was a sample book chapter. So interesting, when you're writing a book proposal, you write sample chapters. Often what you end up writing as a book becomes quite different. So I wrote that chapter about the Antonine Plague for how to think like a Roman emperor, and it didn't go in the book. So it's kind of an outtake, as it were, or it ended up in the book in a completely different form. Some of it did, maybe. Most of that didn't go in the book, actually. And then there's a video, and I think a book review that I did of Backbone, How to Live with Chronic Pain Without Becoming One, by Karen Duffy, who I really enjoyed that book. It's a very different type of book. It's more kind of light-hearted self-help, so it might be more some people's cup of tea than others. It's not an academic book, it's kind of chatty and humorous. And Karen, or Duff, has struggled with a kind of neurodegenerative illness for many years and chronic pain, and she does a lot of kind of work around that. And there's a whole section in the book about her discovery of Stoicism and how Stoicism helped her. And my review of it, I use it as a kind of launch pad to talk about some of the techniques that Marcus used. So that's everything that I wanted to cover today. As always, if you want to just comment below the video, and I'll read your comments later and respond to them. Apologies, we're not 100% live today. We're pretty close to being live though, depending on how long it takes me to upload the video. So it's bye-bye once again from me here in Athens, the home of Stoicism.